James Rosen with us now. A brand new book out, and it's out right now. Dick Cheney, Cheney One, a candid conversation with America's most controversial statesman. James, good morning to you.
Hey, great to be with you. Thank you.
Appreciate the time this morning. Dick Cheney, to me, is just a completely interesting, I don't want to say character, but politician, figure in D.C. politics for going on, 30, 40 years. Why did he agree to this lengthy sit-down with you, which turned into a book?
Well, thank you for asking. Thanks for having me on. Cheney One is really the ultimate insider's account of a life spent at the pinnacle of American power from really the Watergate era right up through 9/11 in Iraq and through the current day. And I interviewed the former vice president for close to 10 hours over 3 days last December in his study at his home in Northern Virginia shortly before he turned 74. And I really believe you have never heard Dick Cheney open up like this before, whether it's on his childhood or his views as a Christian, his assessments of the 5 presidents he worked with, including Ronald Reagan, his behind closed doors dealings with other world leaders like Thatcher and Putin and so on, even up to 9/11 when Dick Cheney was really running the federal government in those tense early hours from the bunker below the White House, and the mistakes that he's willing to admit that he and George W. Bush made at various points in the Iraq War. I think he opened up to me because I had covered the Bush-Cheney White House for Fox News. I had traveled the world with Dick Cheney on several different occasions, including to Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. He knew that I would come at the interviews from a point not of hostility but of respect, even though that I would be well briefed and that I would press him hard when required to do so. We were supposed to do 6 hours together. We did 10 hours together.
James, Dick Cheney has been involved in virtually every nook and cranny in government. Did he express to you what he enjoyed the most during his long career?
I think he really loved being a congressman, and I think he loved representing the people of Wyoming in the House of Representatives for 10 years, when he was, in fact, also a member of the House GOP leadership. That's when Dick Cheney, as a political actor, had the freest reign, if you will, because he was working. His constituents, of course, were his boss, but he wasn't working for a president as he was when he was the chief of staff to President Gerald Ford, or the Secretary of Defense to the first President Bush, or Vice President of the second President Bush. And he compiled one of the most conservative voting records in the Congress, and it would still be viewed as such by today's standards, but he was a low-key politician. He was not a bomb thrower. It enabled him to speak not only to the opposite party, but to different segments of the Republican Party. And in fact, we talked about the Tea Party at great length. George W. Bush, as former president, was once asked what he thought of the Tea Party. He said, "These movements come and go." Dick Cheney, when I asked him about the Tea Party, was very complimentary. Said, "These are people who are hardcore conservatives like I am, and I'm glad they're in the Republican Party."
James Rosen with us. Cheney One, the book, a candid conversation with America's most controversial statesman. It's Riley and Scott here on WROK. There have been these rumors, right? The Bush presidency, really a Cheney presidency. He was the shadow president as vice president. He was pulling the levers. He was making decisions. How much of that did you get into? Is there any truth to that in your eyes?
We got into this in great depth. It is a myth that this was really the Cheney presidency and that George W. Bush was somehow in the back seat and Cheney was driving the car. And nobody can refute that myth with more painful first-hand experience than Dick Cheney. He was more influential in the first term than in the second term. And we talked about that ebbing of his influence in the second term and what accounted for it. But there's no question that when the Twin Towers and the Pentagon were struck on the day of 9/11, that Dick Cheney was running the federal government from that bunker below the White House, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, because President Bush was famously in a classroom in Florida when the attacks happened. Cheney had taken, as a congressman, classified training sessions on something called continuity of government, how to make sure, in what was then contemplated to be perhaps a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union, how to make sure that the American government continued functioning. And central to that, of course, is keeping the line of succession intact. And the very first piece of advice that Dick Cheney gave George W. Bush on 9/11, and Bush didn't like it, but he followed it, was stay out of Washington until we get our hands around the situation here. They were getting false reports of pipe bombs going off the State Department. They thought 6 planes, not 4, were involved in the 9/11 attacks. They had to get their arms around the entire aviation system. And if you look at the photographs from that day in that bunker, Cheney is the undisputed center of gravity to whom all the others are deferring. We talked about it in great detail, how the Secret Service literally lifted him up by the seat of his pants and rushed him out of his office, threw him into that bunker. He saw weapons being handed out, and the communications facilities were not up to 21st century scratch. It's a fascinating inside story.
James Rosen with us, his new book, Cheney One. Speaking of Cheney and George W. Bush, I recall reading a couple of years ago about, I guess you'd call it a dispute, and you can tell us how big of one it was, over the potential pardon of Scooter Libby. Was it a true falling out? Is there still a rift between the two? How would you describe that?
No, I don't think there's any enduring rift between the two men, but we have to be clear that the relationship between George W. Bush and Dick Cheney was really always a professional relationship. They were not buddy-buddy per se, although they did go fishing on a couple of occasions. But, as we all remember, Cheney's National Security Advisor and Chief of Staff, Scooter Libby, was prosecuted by the federal government in connection with the complicated story involving the outing of an American CIA operative, Valerie Plame. And there were a lot of people, including Dick Cheney, who thought it was a purely partisan political investigation and a prosecution that shouldn't have been brought. He pushed President Bush to pardon Libby after he was convicted. In the end, Bush only took sufficient action to ensure that Libby would not go to prison, but he did not fully pardon him. And there were tense words exchanged where Cheney told the president, "Mr. President, you're leaving a good man on the field of battle." Mm-hmm. And that struck President Bush hard. I at one point I asked him, "Do you miss George W. Bush?" He said, "Do I miss him?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I feel like you could reach out and touch him any time."
Did you ask Dick Cheney whether, and we just went through this whole Joe Biden will he or won't he thing, and it seemed fairly obvious or fairly clear early on, if I recall correctly, that Dick Cheney was not going to run for the nomination. Did he ever give real serious thought to running for the nomination in 2008?
No, not in 2008, but there was a time when Dick Cheney gave very serious thought to running for the presidency and explored it a bit and found that he probably wouldn't have the fundraising mojo he needed, and that was in the early 90s, in preparation for 1992. But he said the fact that he had renounced a run for the presidency and had basically given up on those ambitions was central to the good working relationship he did have with George W. Bush, because the president always knew that the counsel he was going to get from Dick Cheney was not being advanced to the president's ears with an eye on how it might help Dick Cheney in the Iowa caucuses 4 years hence. And so he knew that he could trust Cheney's advice and that it was given for the right reason.
James Rosen with us, his book, Cheney One, A Candid Conversation with America's Most Controversial Statesman. I know you got to run here, but man, Rockford, Illinois has quite the Fox News connection. Brett Baer, Heather Nauert, you too started a career here in Rockford.
Yes, fond regards for WREX-TV, where I took the job just vacated by Brett Baer. I'm still following him around.
That's not a bad pipeline, I suppose, huh?
Absolutely.
All right, James Rosen, we really appreciate the time. It's a fascinating look at a fascinating man. Cheney One, A Candid Conversation with America's Most Controversial Statesman. Hope the book does very well for you. James, thanks very much.
Your